Oh boy. I don't exactly know how to get into this one, especially since I'm usually such a historic look back guy, but here it is. I don't like the current format anymore. Don't get me wrong, I do strongly believe that this is one of the most skill-expressive formats we've had in a long time, and I do greatly love the fact that games are so heavily interactive to the point where literally either player can win, regardless of openings. The issue for me is in my personal playstyle, and I've had to come to terms with that as of late that I don't like playing Ishizu Tearlaments myself, which has become a major issue when you break down the fact that it is by far and away the most powerful deck in the format to a point where it's a major detriment to not play it in some capacity. This realization for me has been a bit of a slow burn over the course of the last month, and I'd like to dive into the main reasons for that, as it's not just a simple answer of I don't like this deck's playstyle, because in many ways I love aspects of it. I guess we should probably start with defining what specifically Ishizu Tearlaments is to the game as a whole, which requires us to talk about Ishizu Tear is, to put bluntly, one of the most effective control strategies we've seen in the game ever. When I say control, I don't just mean in interacting with your opponent's options, as that comes in some aspect with practically every deck in the format. I refer to control in the terms of a deck's speed and longevity, which is generally on a sort of triangle spectrum, if you will, between aggro, mid-range, and control. Most of you will probably have some kind of cursory knowledge of these deck speeds in terms of other games, specifically those that utilize mana systems like Magic, Hearthstone, or Runeterra. A deck's speed refers to around how quickly you aim to end a game with your deck and how much fuel your deck uses throughout different stages of any given game. An example of this would be like how, in Hearthstone, a deck like Aggro Druid is aiming to end their games relatively quickly through the use of resources early on to put pressure on the opponent, usually not being able to play a long game if the opponent does have adequate responses. Similarly, Evolve Shaman, a mid-range deck, aims to use its resources in that mid-game to make a larger swing of advantage that's more difficult to answer with the limited mana options, like with sudden large minion takeovers. Lastly, there's a deck like the more recent Blood Death Knight, a control deck, whose main game plan is to consistently answer pushes from the opponent with their resources, aiming to make favorable trades through a long stretch of time to win in a pseudo-war of attrition. There are other deck types, like combo strategies, but for the sake of this discussion we're going to focus on those main three, and even within those three, obviously decks can be a mix of playstyles and go down different routes depending on things like matchups and opening hand quality. But this is the general definition of deck types. Different strategies are going to have different levels of viability also, strictly from the rules and natures of the games themselves, like how Runeterra's alternating action system heavily favors mid-range and control strategies compared to aggro ones. In a similar vein, Yu-Gi-Oh! Not having any form of mana resource, with the cards themselves being the primary resource, very much naturally favors strategies of an aggro to mid-range variety, which has been common in recent years. I guess the question is then, how do you define Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies into these three core speed types? And I think the answer to that is actually fairly simple. You know, the kind of decks that throw out a ton of summons, make a massive board, but then have no kind of follow-up if it gets answered? Though it might put up a bunch of negates, the playstyle itself is very much an aggro playstyle, as you're putting all of your eggs into that early game basket. For an alternative take, let's look at a deck like Sprite, which aims to make a modest board with interaction points and negates, but also has fuel in the tank for follow-ups on following turns, though that follow-up might not have as much long game potential as something like Tearlament. Sprite is about as close to the definition of a mid-range deck that we can have in the modern game. Now, with all of this in mind, let's take a look again at Ishizu Tear, a deck that is filled to the absolute brim with control options entirely designed to interrupt your opponent's plays, force them down suboptimal routes, and slowly wear down resources over the span of turns. That is the definition of a control strategy, and the core issue of the format is that this particular strategy has historically not been very powerful in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but has finally reached an event horizon that is going to be difficult to come back from. If we look at when Tearlaments were originally released in Power of the Elements, we see the deck seeing its most viable success with the Danger package, which is very much an aggro-focused core of cards. These, when combined with Tearlaments, gave it the early game pressure needed to create powerful boards with follow-up. But if we look at Tearlament itself, the archetype prides itself on making boards that are comparably weaker to other decks opening boards, but have legs to play a long game in comparison to its contemporaries. Danger Tearlament was much more so a mid-range deck with aggro tendencies, which was complemented by Sprite, another mid-range deck, to make a very mid-range focused format, bringing us back down from the aggro formats present in Nationals, where almost every deck aimed to Scythe lock and end the game off of that. This all changed with the release of Darkwing Blast and subsequently Magnificent Mavens, which gave us both the Bystials and the Ishizu core, both of which are heavy control tools aimed at stripping the opponent down of their resources. These two, when combined with an enabling force like Tearlament's Mills, became a force that essentially requires the opponent to not play using their graveyard, which has become integral to almost every deck in the game to some extent outside of strategies that expressly don't need it like Flu. But even those aren't safe, as the other side of that is while the pieces are great control tools, they can also act as extenders for Tearlaments in their own ways, such as providing bodies on board for Link and Exceeds plays with the Bystials, and cycling back your tier names for more fusion plays or to trigger Kaleido Heart with the Ishizu pieces. Because of Tyr's naturally powerful mid-range nature and its incidental synergy with the Ishizu and Bystial pieces, the deck has become a full-on control deck despite its ability to put up mid-range board threats. And yes, all of this might be good for a skillful format, but it has turned the current Yu-Gi-Oh! Landscape into one far more focused on control than we've seen in a while. Because Yu-Gi-Oh! Hasn't been conductive to a control deck meta in quite some time, the cracks in the game are really starting to form, specifically in the case of the game's time rules. It's no secret that time rules in Yu-Gi-Oh! Have a lot of flaws, but they're designed with the idea in mind that most players are going to be playing aggro or mid-range styled decks, which is why by the time the round is called, most players are expected to be on Game 3, nearing the end of the match. Since we've entered the Tier 0 format, there are more and more matches that are going into time in Game 2, and even in some rare instances in Game 1. This is because of the control nature of Ishizu Tearlaments, as the deck's gameplay style is more focused on a long game rather than a race to run the opponent out. A similar thing happened in mid-2022 with the popularity of Mystic Mine, as the gameplay that came from the card's meta-relevance slowed the pacing of games to a halt, seeing most games turn into passing back and forth until the Mine player could kill or until the opponent drew the out. So many people complained about this because that's not what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about. Whereas in other games, options that slow down an opponent's plays a considerable amount are a lot more common and accepted due to the longer games the mana system enforces. The shift to control is also alienating many players who just don't enjoy that style of gameplay. I know that for at least myself, I'm a mid-range player, and as such, I prefer formats where a mid-range deck is a viable option to play. Not necessarily the only option, but at the very least viable. This is why I enjoyed Pote formats so much, because both Sprite and Tier at the time were mid-range strategies that had a lot of interesting back and forth, but not so much as to slow the game's pace to a grinding halt. Drawing comparisons back to Hearthstone, I absolutely loved the various decks of Rise of Shadows and the early Uldum meta, but once Control Warrior was discovered to be arguably the best deck in the format by a wide margin, games got slow, tedious, and grindy to a point where I wasn't able to enjoy myself anymore. I do recognize that as a mid-range player, I'm naturally going to be unhappy with a format that is more control-focused because of Control's natural tendency to be able to effectively answer mid-range's pushes just simply because of how speed dynamics work. But the issue there is that usually, when a control deck takes over a meta, some form of an aggro option can bring it back in check, creating a pseudo-balance in the meta environment. But here's the thing. Because so many of the aggro decks in the game focus on using their graveyards as a vital resource for their plays, the existence of Bystials and Ishizu makes playing aggro next to impossible. Aggro was effectively pushed out of the meta with these releases, as now any deck that has to pass through the graveyard needs to add in additional cards to counter out these omnipresent threats, like with hand traps like Skullmeister and Ghost Bell. And even then, it's usually not enough, as there are more options on the side of Bystials and Ishizu than there are ways to counter them. On top of that, the usual answers to hand traps like the Bystials don't really work because Bystials stay in the hand until they fully resolve. So counter options like Called by the Grave don't work at all, and Crossout Designator, while being able to temporarily stun a single Bystial, doesn't solve the issue at hand because the Bystial gets to stay in the hand afterwards. The hardest thing about this is that while the Bystials are the best counter to Tearlaments without playing Tearlaments themselves, Bystials are playable in Tearlaments, making the whole issue tenfold more complicated. So aggro has been effectively pushed out of the meta, but what about mid-range? Well, yes, mid-range can still play to an extent thanks to the ability to make formidable boards that aren't susceptible to interruption like aggro decks are. The issue then lies in their long game ability. Mid-range isn't an infinite resource loop, you're going to run out eventually, and the Ishizu core is exactly what Tearlaments needed to be able to keep their resource loop going, making practically all mid-range decks unable to play the long game to the same extent. So aggro is a no-go, and mid-range doesn't have the staying power, so where do we go from here? What's the solution? The sad fact of the matter is, we don't really know. The OCG is still trying to deal with Tearlaments, which they have had far longer than us at this point, but it just seems to be the deck that won't die. Kit Kalos is banned, Sheeran and Rhinoheart are limited, and Havnis is semi-limited, but the deck continues to be completely unstoppable in the OCG, still taking a dominant tier 1 position after so many hits due to the viability of the deck itself. Bystials have taken a hit with Magnamut going to 1, but that isn't enough as they've printed a 4th Bystial name that just fills the missing slots. Agido and Keldo are limited, but Kelbeck and Mudora are still at 3, and with all of these options in combination with player ingenuity, Ishizu Tearlaments is still the most dominant deck by a wide margin in the OCG. There's also the added issue of Kashtira, which makes the issue far more complicated as the literal combination of the two archetypes with Kashtira Tearlaments has made the two decks that were poised to oppose each other at the end of the day, combining to be even more of an issue. Many would call for the absolute destruction of the deck off of these failed callings, but I'm not sure if that's really the best thing to do. We're in unprecedented waters here with an extended control dominated space, and though it is overbearing currently, I don't believe removing control entirely from the format is the way to go. Yes, Tearlaments are overtuned, extremely overtuned even, but they have brought back control into the format in a way we haven't seen in a long time. And while I personally might not like to play control, there are plenty of players who do. Ideally, we would see a format of options for the players where there's at least one major viable deck for each aggro, mid-range, and control, but this is easier said than done. If we use the archetypes that are already in the meta to try and balance them out, we have our control strategies in Tearlaments mixed with the Ishizu cores and the soon-to-be released Kashtira pieces. We have our mid-range strategy in Sprite, especially with the Gishki pieces that are about to release. But in order to balance out the meta, we need two things to happen. Number one, we have to bring control down to be a little more in line with where mid-range is currently. This does not mean kill Tearlaments. This purely means to cap their power level enough to where they are consistently on par with other decks like Sprite. Number two, we need to promote an aggro deck that does not feature lights and darks or heavy graveyard usage. This one is probably going to be the far more difficult point, as currently every deck that could potentially be a strong enough aggro strategy to fill the space features heavy usage of the chaos attributes, usage of the graveyard, or both. The only way for an aggro deck to be able to actually thrive in this space is if they do not buckle to a single Bystial or Ishizu piece interrupting their plays, though multiple could still pose an issue. While I feel the OCG is moving towards that balance a little bit with step 1, the aggro issue is still present and we're not nearing any form of a result with step 2. It's going to take some time to balance, probably close to a year or more, but seeing where the game is now, I do believe that balance is achievable, and we very well may finally see it in the game we all love. Thank you all for watching to the very end. An extra big thank you to Prinrin, Ryza339, and all of my other patrons over on Patreon. If you want to catch videos a day before they drop here on YouTube, consider supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and comment down below, and consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help me out. If you want more info for the behind the scenes for these videos, be sure to follow me on Twitter or check out my Twitch streams when they happen. Both links are in the description below. Last but not least, I have a Discord now. I barely use it at this point in time, but I'm hoping to change that in the coming months, so feel free to join via the link below, and I hope to see you all on the server soon. Thank you all again, and I'll see you next time.